the haunting of an isolated place. The village had always been a place of whispers, a forgotten relic of time swallowed by the slow decay of the surrounding hills. Nestled in a remote valley, its cobbled streets and crumbling stone houses seemed untouched by the passage of centuries, as though the world had moved on while it remained frozen in some ancient, forgotten past. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old wood, and the wind that swept through the narrow alleys carried an eerie stillness, as if the very land held its breath in anticipation of something unseen. It was a place that few dared to visit, and those who did rarely returned. The old man who lived at the edge of the village had spoken of it in hushed tones, his voice trembling as he recounted stories passed down through generations. He spoke of a time when the valley had been home to something far older than the village itself, something that had watched from the shadows, waiting. The tales were vague, fragmented, but they all pointed to a presence that had never truly left, only grown stronger with time. The villagers had long since abandoned the old ways, the rituals that had once kept the thing at bay, and now the silence was all that remained. The protagonist, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and an unshakable sense of foreboding, had arrived at the village under the cover of twilight. The journey had been arduous, the road winding through dense forests and over hills that seemed to shift in the moonlight. There had been a strange unease in the air, and now the silence was all that remained. The entire way, as though the land itself was watching, waiting for them. Now, standing at the edge of the village, they could feel it, the weight of something vast and unseen pressing against their mind, whispering in a language they could not understand but somehow knew. The village was quiet, too quiet. No lights flickered in the windows, no sounds of life drifted from the cobbled streets. It was as if the village had been abandoned not by choice but by necessity, and yet the protagonist could not shake the feeling that they were not alone. Something was watching. Something had been watching for a long time. The protagonist's arrival and the weight of the past. The protagonist had always been drawn to the unknown, but this journey was different. It was not driven by a thirst for adventure or a desire to escape the mundane, but by something far more personal, a need to confront the past that had haunted their family for generations. They had grown up hearing stories of the village whispered by their grandmother in the dim glow of a flickering lamp. She spoke of an ancient presence that had once walked among the people, a being whose name had been lost to time but whose influence lingered in the blood of their ancestors. These stories had always been dismissed as mere folklore, the kind of tales that old people told to keep the young in line. But as the protagonist grew older, they began to wonder if there was truth in the stories, a truth that had been buried beneath layers of fear and silence. A journey to the village had been undertaken, with a mix of trepidation and determination. They had spent months preparing, researching the history of the region, poring over old maps and forgotten records that hinted at the village's connection to the ancient entity. Their motivation was clear: to uncover the truth, to understand the force that had shaped their family's legacy. But as they stood at the edge of the village, the weight of the past pressed heavily upon them. The silence was not just a void, it was a presence, an unspoken acknowledgement of the thing that had once been and still remained. The protagonist's background was marked by a deep sense of isolation, a feeling that they had always been an outsider, even within their own family. Their parents had left the village long ago, seeking a life free from the shadows that had followed their ancestors. But the protagonist had never been able to escape the pull of the place, a pull that had only grown stronger with time. They had come here not just to uncover the truth, but to confront the thing that had shaped their existence, to face the legacy they had inherited. As they stepped into the village, the air seemed to shift, thickening around them like a tangible force. The cobbled streets were littered with debris, remnants of a life that had once thrived but now lay in ruin. The buildings, though crumbling, bore the marks of something ancient, their stone walls etched with symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The protagonist felt a strange unease, a sense that they were being watched, that the village itself was aware of their presence. It was not just the stories that had drawn them here, it was the feeling that the village was calling them back, that the entity they had come to confront was waiting. And as they ventured deeper into the village, the first signs of the ancient entity's presence began to take shape, subtle at first but growing stronger with every step they took. The first signs of the ancient entity's presence were subtle, almost imperceptible at first. The protagonist had expected to find remnants of the past. Ancient carvings on the walls, forgotten artifacts buried beneath layers of dust and time. But what they found was something far more unsettling. As they moved deeper into the village, the air grew colder, thick with a scent that was neither earth nor decay, but something older, almost imperceptible at first. The protagonist had expected to find remnants of the past ancient carvings on the walls, something that defied description. The silence was not the absence of sound, but a presence in itself, pressing against their ears like a whisper just beyond hearing. They had come upon a ruin at the heart of the village, a structure that seemed to predate the village itself. Its walls were covered in strange, interwoven symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim light as though they were alive. The protagonist traced their fingers along the carvings, feeling the rough texture of the stone beneath their skin, but the moment their touch met the surface, a shiver ran through their body. It was not cold, but a sensation that sent a wave of unease through them, as if the stone itself was aware of their presence. Inside the ruin, the air was thick with the weight of something unseen. The protagonist's torch flickered, casting long, shifting shadows that moved of their own accord, stretching and twisting in ways that defied logic. They had heard the stories before, of the entity that had once walked among the people, of the rituals that had been performed to keep it at bay, but now, standing in the heart of the ruin, they felt the truth of those stories settle over them like a shroud. There was no sign of the entity, no form, no shape, no voice, and yet the presence was undeniable. It was as if the very air around them was thick with an ancient awareness, watching, waiting. The protagonist could not shake the feeling that they were not alone, that something was watching them from the darkness just beyond the reach of their torchlight. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their own breathing, the slow, measured rhythm of their heart. They tried to move forward, but their steps felt heavy, as though the ground itself resisted their passage. The walls of the ruin seemed to close in around them, the symbols on the stone glowing faintly, as if they were responding to their presence. The protagonist felt a strange compulsion to turn back, but something deeper, something older, held them in place. And then, from the depths of the ruin, a sound, low, resonant, like the distant echo of a voice that had not spoken in centuries. It was not a voice, not in the way humans understood sound, but something else entirely. A presence, a whisper in the marrow of their bones. The protagonist froze, their breath catching in their throat. They had come, seeking the truth, but now, standing in the heart of the ruin, they realized that the truth was not something they could simply uncover. It was something that had been waiting for them, something that had been watching for far longer than they had ever imagined. The entity's influence begins. The moment the sound faded, the protagonist felt a shift, not in the air, nor in the structure around them, but within themselves. It was as if the entity had reached into their mind, not with force, but with a slow, insidious touch, like the first brush of a cold wind against the skin. Their thoughts, once sharp and focused, now felt distant, as though they were observing themselves from a great distance. The weight of the ruin pressed against their chest, not physically, but in the way that something unseen could make a person feel trapped within their own body. They took a step forward, but the movement felt unnatural, as though their limbs were no longer their own. The torch in their hand flickered, its flame no longer steady, but pulsing in time with an unseen rhythm. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, and for a moment the protagonist thought they could see something moving within the carvings, a shape that twisted and writhed like ink bleeding through water. They turned, but the shadows that had once been still now shifted, stretching and coiling as though they had a will of their own. A whisper, or perhaps a thought, pressed against their mind. It was not a voice, not in the way humans spoke, but something deeper, something that did not belong to the carvings, a shape that twisted and writhed like ink bleeding through water. They turned, but the shadows that had once been still now shifted, stretching and coiling as though they had a will of their own. Realm of language. It was a sensation, a feeling of being watched, of being known. The protagonist's breath came in shallow gasps, their heart hammering in their chest. They had come here seeking answers, but now they were beginning to understand the truth. This was not a place where answers were given, but where they were taken. The entity was not merely present, it was watching them, studying them, perhaps even testing them. The realization sent a wave of terror through the protagonist's body. They had always believed that the entity was an ancient force, something beyond human comprehension, something that had existed before the village, before the people who had once lived here. But now, standing in the heart of the ruin, they felt the entity's presence not as a distant, unknowable force, but as something that was aware of them, that had been waiting for them to come. Their mind was no longer their own. The thoughts that had once been clear and rational now felt fragmented, as though they were being pulled apart by an unseen hand. They could not remember the path they had taken to reach this place, nor could they recall the words they had spoken before. Even their own name felt distant, as though it had been taken from them. The entity was not just watching them, it was erasing them, piece by piece, replacing them piece by piece, replacing them with something else. The protagonist tried to move, to run, to escape, but their body refused to obey. Their legs felt heavy, their arms sluggish, as though they were being held back by an invisible force. The walls of the ruin seemed to close in around. The entity was not just watching them, it was erasing them piece by piece, replacing them with something else. The protagonist tried to move. The symbols glowing brighter, pulsing in time with the slow, measured rhythm of their own heartbeat. The air was thick with something unseen, something that pressed against their skin, against their mind, against their very soul. And then the whisper came again, not as a sound, but as a feeling, a presence that wrapped around them like a cold hand on their shoulder. It was not a voice, not in any way that could be understood, but it was a message, a warning, a promise. The entity was not finished with them, it had only just begun. The entity was not finished with them, it had only just begun. The entity's grip tightens, the protagonist's body trembled as the entity's influence deepened, pressing against them like a tide that could not be resisted. The air was thick with a presence that no longer felt like a whisper, but it was a message, a warning, a promise. The entity was not finished with them, it had only just begun. The entity's grip tightens, it is not finished with them, with his not-be entity's influence deepened, pressing against them like a tide that could not be. An unseen weight that pressed down upon their mind and body alike. Their thoughts, once their own, now felt foreign, as though they were being rewritten by something ancient and unknowable. They tried to resist, to fight back, but the entity had already taken root in the very core of their being. Their limbs moved of their own accord, no longer guided by their will but by something else, something that had no need for human intent. They stumbled forward, their steps unsteady, as if walking through a dream that was not their own. The ruin around them seemed to shift, the walls no longer fixed but fluid, stretching and warping as though they were not made of stone, but of something far older, something that had existed before the first human had ever drawn breath. The symbols on the walls pulsed with a slow, rhythmic glow, and the protagonist could feel them reaching out, not just to them, but to something deeper within them. Their mind was no longer their own. The entity was not just watching them, it was inside them, threading its presence into the very fabric of their thoughts. They could hear voices, not in the way of human speech, but as a flood of sensations, of knowledge that did not belong to them. It was not language, but a form of understanding that bypassed words entirely, a presence that filled their mind with images, with memories that were not their own. They saw things, places they had never been, things they had never seen, and yet they knew them as if they had lived them. Their body was no longer under their control. The entity had taken hold of them, and they could feel it moving through them, reshaping them, altering them. They could feel their skin tightening, their muscles shifting, as if something within them was being reformed, as if they were not human anymore, but something else, something that had once been and would be again. The air around them was no longer still, but alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the slow, measured beat of their own heart. A wave of terror surged through them, but it was not the terror of the unknown, but of the realization that they were no longer themselves. The entity had taken them, had claimed them, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The walls of the ruin seemed to close in around them, the symbols glowing brighter, pulsing in time with the entity's presence. They could feel it pressing against their mind, against their body, against their very soul, and they knew that they were not the only one who had felt this. The entity had been waiting for them, and now it had found them. It had taken them, and there was no escape. The protagonist could feel the weight of the entity's presence pressing against them, a force that could not be resisted, that could not be denied. And as the last remnants of their own mind faded, they realized the truth. This was not just a place of ancient horror, but of transformation, of becoming something else, something that had once been and would be again. And they were no longer human. Desperation and the futility of escape. The protagonist tried to move, but their body refused to obey. Their limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as though they were being held back by an unseen force. The air around them was thick with the presence of the entity, pressing against their skin, against their mind, against their very soul. They could feel it watching them, waiting for them to make a move, to try to flee, to resist. But they had no strength left, no will, no power to fight back. The entity had already taken them, had already claimed them, and there was no escape. They tried to scream, but no sound came from their throat. Their mouth opened, but nothing escaped. The entity had taken their voice, their thoughts, their very will. All that remained was the overwhelming sensation of being trapped, of being consumed. The air around them was thick, was of ruin. Closed in around them was thick, was of power. The symbols on the stone glowing brighter, pulsing in time with the entity's presence. They could feel it moving through them, reshaping them, altering them. They were no longer human. They were something else, something that had once been and would be again. A wave of panic surged through them, but it was not the panic of a person who had been captured, but of something deeper, something older. They had come here seeking the truth, but now they understood that the truth was not something that could be uncovered. It was something that had been waiting for them, something that had been waiting for centuries, waiting for the moment when they would come, when they would be taken. The protagonist tried to run, but their legs would not move. They could feel the entity's presence pressing against them, reshaping the truth, but now they understood that the truth was not something that could be uncovered. It was something that had been waiting for them, something that had been waiting, holding them in place, forcing them to remain where they were. The walls of the ruin seemed to shift, to stretch, to warp, as if they were not made of stone, but of something far older, something that had existed before the first human had ever drawn breath. The symbols on the walls pulsed with a slow, rhythmic glow, and the protagonist could feel them reaching out, not just to them, but to something deeper within them. They tried to think, to remember, to fight back, but their mind was no longer their own. The entity had taken them, had erased them, had replaced them with something else. They could feel it moving through them, reshaping them, altering them. They were no longer human. They were something else, something that had once been and would be again. The entity watched. It waited. It had no need for human resistance, for human will. It had already taken them. There was no escape. The protagonist's thoughts turned to the village, to the people who had once lived here, who had tried to resist the entity's presence, who had tried to keep it at bay, but they had failed. The entity had taken them just as it had taken the protagonist. They had tried to flee, to run, to escape, but the entity had always been waiting. And now the protagonist was no different. They could feel the entity's presence pressing against them, a force that could not be resisted, that could not be resisted, that could not be denied. The walls of the ruin closed in around them, the symbols glowing brighter, pulsing in time with the entity's presence. They were no longer human. They were something else, and the entity had already taken them, the revelation of the ancient entity. The moment the protagonist tried to move, the world around them shifted. The ruin, the walls, the symbols. They were no longer just remnants of a forgotten past, but something far older, something that had existed before the first human had ever drawn breath. The entity was not a being of flesh and bone, not in any way that could be understood by human minds. It was something else, something that had no form, no shape, no name, and yet it was everything. It was the void between stars, the silence before time, the whisper that had never spoken and yet had always been heard. The protagonist could feel it pressing against them, not with force, but with understanding. It was not merely watching them, it was knowing them, knowing everything they had ever been, everything they had ever thought, everything they had ever feared. It had been waiting for them just as it had waited for those who had come before. The village had not been abandoned by choice, but by necessity. The people who had lived here had not been consumed by the entity, but by the knowledge of its presence. They had tried to resist, to flee, to keep it at bay, but the entity had always been waiting, always had been watching, and now it had found them. The symbols on the walls pulsed in time with the entity's presence, glowing with the symbols on the walls pulsed in time with the entity's presence, glowing with a slow, rhythmic light that seemed to match the beat of the protagonist's own heart. They could feel it moving through them. Reshaping them, altering them. It was not taking them, it was making them something else, something that had once been and would be again. The entity was not a thing of horror, not in the way humans understood fear. It was not a monster, not a demon, not a god. It was something beyond all of those things, something that had no need for human comprehension, no need for human resistance. Body no longer obeyed there. The protagonist's mind was no longer their own. The entity had taken them, had erased them, had replaced them with something else. They could feel it moving through them, reshaping them, altering them. They were no longer human. They were something else, something that had once been and would be again. And the entity had already taken them, the final descent. The protagonist's body, no need for human resistance. The protagonist's mind was no longer their own. The entity had taken them, had erased them, had replaced them with something else. Will. The entity had taken them, had consumed them, and now they were nothing more than a vessel, a hollow shell in which the ancient force had chosen to reside. The walls of the ruin pulsed with a slow, rhythmic glow, and the symbols carved into the stone shimmered as if they were alive, as if they were watching. The protagonist could feel the entity moving through them, reshaping them, altering them. They were no longer human. They were something else, something that had once been and would be again. Their thoughts, once their own, had been stripped away. They could no longer remember their name, their past, their purpose. The entity had taken everything, had erased them, had erased them, had erased them, had replaced them with something else. The village had long since fallen to the entity's will, its people consumed, its secrets buried beneath the weight of time. Now, the protagonist was the final piece of the puzzle, the last remnant of a forgotten past that had been waiting for this moment. The air around them thickened, pressing against their skin, against their mind, against their very soul. The entity was no longer just a presence, it was a force, a will, a consciousness that had existed before the first human had ever drawn breath. It had watched, it had waited, and now it had found its way into the protagonist's mind, into their body, into the protagonist's mind, into their body, into their very being. They were no longer themselves, they were the entity, and the entity was them. The ruin around them pulsed with an energy that was not of this world. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, their light stretching out, reaching for the edges of the world, for the stars beyond the sky. The protagonist could feel the entity's presence expanding, spreading through them, through the ruin, through the very fabric of reality itself. They were no longer a single being, no longer a singular consciousness. They were part of something far greater, something that had existed before the first star had ever burned, before the first mountain had ever risen. And still, the entity watched. It waited. It had no need for human resistance, for human will. It had no need for human resistance, for human will. It had already taken them. There was no escape. The protagonist's mind was no longer their own, and they would never be again. The entity had claimed them, had made them something else, something that had once been and would be again. felt the weight of the entity's presence settle over them, not as a burden, but as a final, inescapable truth. They were no longer human. They were the entity, and the entity had never been alone. The aftermath of the ancient horror. The village remained, but it was no longer a place of human habitation. The ruins stood in silence, their crumbling walls untouched by time, as though they had always been and always would be. The symbols etched into the stone still pulsed with a slow, rhythmic glow, as if the entity that had once watched from the shadows still lingered, waiting for the next soul to wander into its domain. The protagonist was gone, their presence erased, their name lost to the wind that howled through the valley. And yet, the entity remained, an unseen force that had claimed them and would claim others in time. The villagers who had once lived here had long since vanished, their fate sealed by the entity's presence. Some had tried to resist, to fight back, to keep the ancient horror at bay. But the entity had always been waiting, always had been watching. It had taken them one by one until the village was left in ruin, its people consumed, its secrets buried beneath the weight of time. The protagonist had been the last to come, the final piece of the puzzle, the final remnant of a forgotten past that had been waiting for this moment. And now they were gone, their mind and body claimed by the entity, their existence erased, their name lost to the wind, but the entity was not finished. It had taken the protagonist, had claimed them, had made them something else, and now it would wait. It would watch. It would wait for the next soul to wander into its domain, for the next person to be drawn by the same unseen force that had drawn the protagonist here. The entity had no need for human resistance, no need for human will. It had always been there, and it would always be there, watching, waiting for the next one to come. The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the whispers of the past, the echoes of those who had come before. The ruins stood in silence, their walls pulsing with an ancient light, their symbols glowing in time with the entity's presence. The village was forgotten, its people lost, its secrets buried beneath the weight of watching, waiting for the next one to come. The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the next one to come. The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the whispers of the past, the echoes of those who had come before. The ruins stood, yet the entity remained, an unseen force that had claimed the protagonist and would claim others in time. And as the wind howled through the valley, the ruins stood in silence, waiting for the next soul to come. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it.